I alluded to Mirrorsoft being a company worthy of a video of its own in my last video when I did Ocean Software, and such a prospect, I have to admit, is quite alluring. You may look at the company on the surface and not see all that much particularly interesting, but that would ignore several things. It would ignore how close they came to beating Nintendo to the license to distribute one of the biggest games of the 1980s. It would ignore how close they came to taking control of the ZX Spectrum altogether. It would ignore a library of games that on the whole was actually very solid. And it would ignore the man at the forefront of it all, one of the most flamboyant and visible figures of the whole decade. Not just in games, but in anything. And of course that means we get to cover the most spectacular of falls. Quite literally, as it turns out. So, Mirrorsoft. We'll split all these little things into nice bite-sized parts, but let's start off with an overview of the man himself. So who was that man in question? Not a programmer, as such, not a designer, not anyone to do with games at all. This man puts almost everyone else I've covered to shame when it comes to the length and breadth of his empire at his peak. This man is Robert Maxwell. Born in the former Czechoslovakia in 1923, Maxwell escaped from the Nazi occupation, actively served in the British Army during World War II, and became a naturalised British citizen shortly after the war. From there he gradually built his publishing dominion while also serving as a Labour MP in the 1960s. One funny quirk of history is that back then Maxwell, a lifelong socialist, was interested in purchasing The Sun and actively tried to purchase the News of the World. An attempt which was blocked and resulted in a scathing editorial about how the News of the World was a British paper, as British as roast beef and Yorkshire pudding. Both papers were then subsequently bought by a man even more British than roast beef and Yorkshire pudding, the Australian tycoon Rupert Murdoch. This event, right at the end of the 1960s, would cast one of many shadows over Robert Maxwell's career. Anywho, this theme continued throughout most of Maxwell's business life. A total expansionist, welcomed by one side of the coin and treated with absolute contempt and distrust by the other who looked for any way to bring him down. Even the Department of Trade and Industry in the early 70s said that he was not a person who can be relied upon to exercise proper stewardship of a publicly quoted company. That roughly translates into English as, he's a fucking crook. Let's just say that those criticisms weren't exactly unfounded, and he came close to losing his entire business. His business practices were brought into question so often that, thanks to the satirical mag Private Eye, he acquired the nickname of the Bouncing Check. This was a nickname that old Robert didn't particularly enjoy. And yet the Maxwell empire bounced back. In fact, it grew further despite any controversies. And he was more than willing to fight tooth and nail for his reputation in the courts. That previous statement actually resulted in Maxwell getting the law changed so that public figures criticised by the government in such ways would be notified in advance so that they could prepare for it accordingly, believe it or not. Maxwell was, through the 70s and 80s, also very publicly living the high life. He was the embodiment of the swaggering British tycoon. A love of yachts, a chomper of massive cigars, host of impossibly extravagant functions, a controlling interest in 3 professional football clubs at a time when no one figured that such a thing could ever possibly cause a conflict of interest. He controlled a record company, had substantial shares in MTV Europe, a whole horde of publishing firms worldwide, a cable TV company. His empire was huge, and Maxwell was at the forefront of just about every bit of it. A public figure who, if he could, would advertise everything under his purview entirely by himself. His status as one of the most powerful and visible figures on the left could bring him into contact with virtually anybody, including basically everyone on the other side of the wall, even the leaders. Prime ministers said that his knowledge and insight into communist regimes was at times invaluable. Such hobnobbing led to various accusations, most famously of all that Robert Maxwell was, in actuality, a super spy for Mossad. To go into this would take up the entire rest of the video, but the articles, documentaries and many, many books are there for everyone to peruse and make up their own minds. Still, Robert Maxwell's goal had always been to have his own daily newspaper. Previously it was a matter of expansion. Now it was also a matter of revenge. To cap off his triumphant return, he must not just beat, but destroy Rupert Murdoch at his own game. And in 1984, he got his paper, when he bought out the Mirror Group for £113 million, publishers of a popular pro-Labour tabloid, the Daily Mirror. Maxwell's empire and influence was greater at this point than it had ever been, and his sphere was magnetic. The journalist who said that he could prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Robert Maxwell was a crook and a liar, ended up writing Maxwell's official biography. Through charm? Threats? Bribery? All of the above, possibly, and probably at the same time. As public as he was, let us not mince words, Robert Maxwell was not a nice man. Jack Tramiel is the nastiest piece of work I've looked at up to this point, and Maxwell at his worst would have torn his fucking throat out. There is no comparison. The word most often used to describe Maxwell, in private and often in public, aside from crook obviously, was one that would also describe a fair few of the leaders that he used to pal around with. Tyrant. Anyway, with the deal to buy the Mirror Group came Mirrorsoft. These guys had an interesting history of their own. They were originally founded in 1982 by a former British Royal Navy officer, Jim McConaughey, in partnership with the Mirror. McConaughey is credited as being one of the founding fathers of the flight simulator, helping to develop the groundbreaking Falcon in 1984 for Spectrum Holobyte, and despite not having a background in games and coming into them at a rather late age, his passion for the industry would never die. Still, Mirrorsoft generally didn't publish such games at first. Instead, they first focused on publishing educational games. One of their first and most famous titles was First Steps with the Mr. Men from 1983 for the Spectrum, a licensed game based on Roger Hargreaves' famous creation, who also had a strip in the Mirror. Mirrorsoft would go on to publish 4 more Mr. Men games, creating their first consistently successful franchise. They also published BBC Mastermind in 1984, a computer version of the popular Started So I'll Finish quiz show, presumably called such to differentiate it from Mastermind, the then popular sequence matching board game which had already been converted to the Specky and the like, and other titles included the likes of Quick Thinking from 1983 and Old MacDonald Had a Farm from 1984. Now, I'd be lying if I said that any of these titles were particularly interesting, although they do bring back the odd memory or two. Most people's memories of educational software start with the likes of Freddy Fish and what have you, so it's curious to see what edutainment looked like back in the very early days. So what changed when Robert Maxwell took over? He had said that he would be happy to let all departments of the Mirror Group follow their own editorial directions, and you do wonder exactly how much interest the 60-year-old Maxwell would have had in the world of video games and computers in general, but to think that it would be none would be foolish. Maxwell knew that there was a lot of potential here, and he sought to expand his influence into the world of computers as aggressively as he had pursued interests in every other conceivable field. And this meant that Mirrorsoft would quickly stop publishing just educational titles. They moved into the arcade market in 1985 with games like Dynamite Dan 1 and 2. They even ended up publishing early flight sims like the aforementioned Falcon and another one that Jim McConaughey was involved in, Mr. Micro's Spitfire 40. He controlled shares in the American company Spectrum Holobyte, positioning them as Mirrorsoft's sister company in the US. But just publishing arcade-style games and the like, well, that was only the start of it. Maxwell's entrance into the world of computers potentially came at just the right time, although in the end it did come a little too late. Not long after his purchase of Mirrorsoft, he saw an opportunity to expand even further. Now, as you may know already, Sinclair Research and their owner, good old Sir Clive, had a particularly bad year in 1985. They tried to branch out further with Sinclair vehicles and watched in horror as their first product, the C5, was mocked to high heaven at best and called a death trap at worst. Their serious business microcomputer, the QL, had tanked utterly. Even the purported latest version of their flagship product, the Spectrum Plus, had disappointed. With the 128K Spectrum apparently on the horizon, no one exactly cared much about it. Oh yeah, and waiting for the 128K Spectrum had pissed off so many distributors that they'd started to manufacture their own models because Sinclair Research couldn't. It was the year that the Wabakis died, and Sinclair Research were in freefall. They were basically making absolutely no money whatsoever. Sir Clive's knighthood a couple of years previously was perhaps the high watermark for microcomputers, and now his company were in danger of being the biggest casualty of the market's downward swing. It should be mentioned too that the press was all too eager to cover every step of the downfall. It's not just that Sir Clive Sinclair was knighted so quickly, he was one of Margaret Thatcher's golden boys. After all, even though the Spectrum may have been a computer for the masses that brought all different kinds of people into the computer world, he himself was a devout conservative. He was Thatcher's new captain of British industry, essentially. And all of his failures were recounted painfully, inch by inch. And to be honest, rightly so, because they were truly diabolical. Having a fight with your fellow rival in a pub on Christmas in 1984 didn't help much either. And no, that did actually happen. But it wasn't just him who was struggling, everyone was. Acorn couldn't supply enough computers to meet demand, their flagship BBC Micro had spectacularly failed to break America, and as for Commodore, well, we've been through that one already. Christmas 1983 had been the highest point, the time when a microcomputer was the absolute hot thing to have. But 1984 was when the demand started to drop. By 1985, things were looking bleak, particularly for Sinclair. And then there was a saviour, and no, his name was not Lord Sir Alan Sugar. Robert Maxwell unveiled his ambitious plan to buy Sinclair Research in June of 1985. For an injection of £12 million, his empire would assume control, with Sir Clive reduced to, more honorific duties. It looked very promising, and the deal even made the front pages. Well, of the Mirror anyways, who ran with "Maxwell saves Sinclair" as their top story. Even Thatcher was reportedly pleased that the company she had handpicked as her golden horse was at least going to be saved, protecting her from any potential embarrassment. And then, well, it just didn't happen. A couple of months later, Maxwell pulled out of the deal. Maybe Sir Clive balked at it, not wanting to be kicked upstairs into a role where he had no responsibility. Maybe Robert Maxwell looked at it again and thought that Sinclair was not a company that was worth saving. Maybe it was all a publicity stunt and Robert Maxwell never had any intention at all of saving Sinclair Research. No one really knows why the deal fell apart, and as a result Sinclair had their backs to the wall again. It is interesting to speculate, of course. The big question is, what future would Sinclair Research have had under the purview of Robert Maxwell? The short and obvious answer to this is, well, not much after 1991, but it is certainly interesting to speculate what would have occurred in the meantime. But we do already know the end of this story. Sinclair's prince did come, in the form of a cockney beardy hedgehog type who presumably shouted a lot, said "you're fired" to a lot of people, and prevented the whole thing from becoming a bloody disaster. And it's not the most famous deal that Maxwell and Mirrorsoft were involved in. Around the same time as all this was going on, in June of '84, a young Russian programmer named Alexei Pajitnov amused his colleagues with a game where you had to delete tetrominos from a well by forming lines out of them. Tetris, as it was known, would spread through Eastern Europe like wildfire before eventually being first discovered, apparently, by the UK software house Andromeda. And from there the fight for Tetris's rights began. Whole books have been written on this fight, and all the companies involved in it. The only thing that's ever really certain about this, one of the first times an Eastern product had hit pay dirt in the West, is that Pajitnov himself didn't see a single cent of Tetris's profit until well after the fall of the wall. Mirrorsoft were one of the most vocal companies when it came to securing the rights to Pajitnov's game, in spite of the overtures of Nintendo, who wanted Tetris as one of the launch titles for their new handheld system, the Game Boy. The whole thing was outrageously shady. Mirrorsoft and Maxwell's claim was that they had the rights to Tetris because the American company Spectrum Holobyte, you know, the sister company of Mirrorsoft that's also under the Maxwell umbrella, had purchased the rights to it from Andromeda. But where did Andromeda get the rights from? Did they even have the right to sell the rights to Tetris? In any case, Mirrorsoft wanted nothing less than exclusivity to Tetris, a piece of every version of the game, and would seemingly do just about anything to secure that. It was even reported that Robert Maxwell himself had stepped in to help broker the deal through his connections. And yes, you may well wonder exactly what that meant. Maybe he sought an audience with Gorbachev himself to try and get the game? Probably not. However, Mirrorsoft were able to sell Tetris for computers using those whites from Andromeda, and naturally did so pretty sharpish all things considered, resulting in the sale of what is probably their most successful game on various computers through 1987 and 1988. Mirrorsoft's version of Tetris is, as you would probably expect, the one that hams up the Soviet mystique the most. It's right there in the box art and right there in the title, which did more than anything to popularise the classic trope that in order to write in Russian, all you do is write the R's the other way around.
It's in Russian.
You just put the R's the wrong way round.
As for the game itself, well, it's Tetris basically. The music is pretty cracking throughout actually, which is nice, but the game does default to having these backgrounds in the world that make it incredibly hard to see what's going on. Fortunately, you can turn these off, and once you do, you get a perfectly acceptable, no-frills game of Tetris. It's easy to see why it was so popular, and Lord knows I've put many hours into Tetris across various versions in my time. They certainly went all out with the presentation, occasionally to the game's fault, but at its core it's the same bloody good game as ever. Obviously it's not going to replace the Game Boy version in anyone's mind, but it was still a stonking success on just about any computer it was released on. So how did it all work out in the end? Well, it's a doozy. The Russian state-owned company Elorg takes over the responsibility of selling the rights to Tetris in '88, and figure out quickly that Andromeda's deal to sell the rights to Mirrorsoft was a complete load of bollocks, forcing them to negotiate a proper deal. Henk Rogers, a Dutch games publisher, brokers a deal with Nintendo to bring Tetris to the Game Boy, but still needs the rights to the game first, and Mirrorsoft want that deal too. A punishing meeting in Moscow ensues between Rogers, Andromeda's Robert Stein, son of Robert, Kevin Maxwell, and various KGB officials in a toe-to-toe fight for the rights. And in the end, Rogers wins the clusterfuck, and Nintendo get the rights to produce Tetris. And you know the part where I said that surely Robert Maxwell didn't try to intervene with Gorbachev personally to get the deal changed? He actually did. This could go on and on, but after that, it might be best to draw the line here. So, with the big stuff out of the way, perhaps we can retreat from documentary mode for a little while and just look at what Mirrorsoft published for a bit. And actually there's a lot of really quite good games here, particularly for the Amiga. Mirrorsoft were quite a strong publishing house with a pretty good hit rate on the whole through their 7 or so quite short years of existence. A lot of these didn't actually come out with Mirrorsoft on the box, with the company preferring to use labels like Imageworks and PSS for most of their games. So let's have a look at them. Tetris and Mr. Men aside, Mirrorsoft released a fair few decent titles on the older microcomputers, the Speccy and what have you. One of their first proper arcadey games, Dynamite Dan, is a platformer in the same vein as the likes of Jet Set Willy and what have you. And honestly, it's one of the absolute best games in this little genre, filled with a ton of personality. Like all of these games, it's stupidly hard, but you'll have fun with it so long as you've got lots of patience. There's a few other things you can find on the Spectrum that are pretty solid. Here's Fernandez Must Die, a top-down shooter that's one of the busier on the system. You can even ride around in jeeps here, giving it a pace you don't often find in this sort of game on the Specky. I'd rate this higher than I'd rate something like Rambo or Ikari Warriors. It's bloody good actually. You got the odd little weird license. Andy Cap for the C64 seems like one anyway, but then Andy Cap was a cartoon strip in the mirror, so it does make perfect sense. The game itself is an odd side-scrolling adventure where you get into fights with your wife, try to buy fags, and find your gyro because you're a pissed up unemployed northerner. Yay for tabloid stereotypes. Then there's Biggles, a game featuring Captain W.E. Johns's plucky British hero for boys. An odd one that goes from shoot 'em up to run and gun to trying to jump from roof to roof. It fails at all of them, but I remember playing it quite a lot. As a matter of fact, I was trying to find my copy of the game to play last weekend, but for the life of me I just couldn't find it anyway. Where the hell was Biggles when I needed him last Saturday? I was heard to shout around my neighbourhood. However, my undoubted favourite of Mirrorsoft Specky games is this one, Mean Streak. I love Mean Streak. It's dead simple, you just rush around a track killing one biker after another, but it's brilliant, quite Mad Max-ish. It'd just need a bit of music for something to just make it a real doozy. However, I would say that Mirrorsoft as a publisher came into their own when they hit the Amiga. It's about here where they felt that the Mirrorsoft label didn't quite fit in with major action games, I suppose, and so they created the Imageworks label to publish most of their Amiga games. And in doing so, they published the games of some of the best developers of the generation. Imageworks published 4 Bitmap Brothers titles. The original Speedball is pretty cool for such an early game, it has to be said. Xenon 2 is quite an early game as well, a vertical shmup that was insanely praised back then as one of the Amiga's next-gen titles due to the pumping soundtrack, graphics and the like. Sadly, it has probably aged worse than every other game in this video, to be honest. Then there's the isometric action-adventure, Cadaver. One of the Bitmap's oddest games, it's a bit confusing at first and very tough, but it can hook you in if you get into it. And then the last Bitmap title for Imageworks is, well, rather nondescript. Why, it's only Speedball 2 Brutal Deluxe, which so happens to be one of the greatest games ever made for the Amiga, and probably the Bitmap's crowning glory, matched only by the Chaos engine. I have a video entirely dedicated to the Speedball series that you can check out, but needless to say, Speedball 2 is a work of genius, one of the most intense experiences you'll find on the whole computer. That's hardly all she wrote, mind you. Mirrorsoft, in conjunction with Faster Than Light, published Dungeon Master for the Amiga and ST. This might not look much now, but this particular dungeon crawler? Well, it helped to popularise an entire frickin' genre, a streamlined evolution of what you previously saw in the very early likes of Ultima and Wizardry, based totally around getting a party together, finding gold and killing skeletons. Lots of them. And while this is only a bit part role, Mirrorsoft were the publishers in Europe for just about all of Cinemaware's Amiga games. Defender of the Crown here, from 1985, was arguably the first game that showed exactly what the Amiga could do. It was absolutely groundbreaking. It's not held up today, but I dare say that very few games have felt quite as next-gen as this one did when it was first released. Almost all of Cinemaware's titles fit into this vein, being absolutely staggering examples of presentation that didn't shirk on gameplay either. Games such as It Came From the Desert, or The King of Chicago. A lot of story to go with bits of shooting and so forth. They even tried their hand at sports, with games like TV Sports Basketball and what have you. Again, how well it's held up is questionable, but it looks ridiculous for 1989. My favourite of theirs though, and indeed probably a lot of people's favourites, is their final game, the epic flight sim and historical tale of World War I that is Whims. Considering how fickle this business can be, there's very few software houses who can say that they went out on such a brilliant final game. I alluded to Mirrorsoft nicking the odd licence here and there from the likes of Ocean, and indeed they did, although this did make for some of their weaker titles. Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles was done twice by them, the first being a computer version of the original NES game. I kind of dig this on the Spectrum, although I recognise its flaws. Mind you, the NES game was pretty flawed too, and to my knowledge this version of the game is not impossible to complete, so, you know, that's a plus point. Imageworks also released a version of the arcade game for computers that I've covered before. It's not exactly special, with a crippling multiload especially that brings it down, but it is also of note as being the final game that Mirrorsoft ever released. There was also Predator 2 for computers, a rather humdrum shooter game that plays a bit like The Punisher for the NES, but not anywhere near as good. Their worst licence, however, and probably worst game of them all, is Back to the Future Part 3, one of the worst licensed games ever made in fact. You know what I think? I feel that this game is a purposeful attempt by hacks to nick the Cinemaware style of doing things, but it's just royally, and I truly mean royally, screwed up. You can play this on the Mega Drive too if you really want to, although that was published by Acclaim on their Arena label. Anything of note that doesn't really fit elsewhere? Mirrorsoft published Maxis's first ever game in Europe, the venerable Sky Chase. It's not remembered much today, but it is an okay little dogfight sim. Then there's Brat, an isometric action puzzler for the Amiga. Not much of a special game at the time, and certainly not now, but it's one of those games that I remember seeing a lot on the gaming TV shows of the time. Similar to Ocean's Sleepwalker a couple of years later, or Heimdall, my defining memory of the game is listening to Dominic Diamond and a crowd of youngsters shout all over it. Robozone is a game that I wonder how many people remember today, but it's quite cool. An action game with Terminator-esque aesthetics, a seriously pumping soundtrack and a few different styles of play chucked in. Mirrorsoft, as mentioned, had the PSS software house under their wing, and here's an example of what they'd do. Austerlitz. It's a serious historical strategy game, quite dry and definitely for hardened veterans, but probably really good if you dig this sort of thing. And finally, here's one of their last games, First Samurai, another game that ended up ported on consoles. It's a bloody good side-scroller with a wicked sense of humour to boot, one that had lots of potential, and indeed after the fallout of everything, Psygnosis would pick this up and later release the sequel, Second Samurai. Ah, yes, Fallout. It's about time to stop covering games almost entirely, I'm afraid, for this story does have an end. I promised a spectacular one, and I can certainly give that to you. So without any further ado, here we go. As the 90s rolled around, Robert Maxwell's empire was in a bit of a mire. There had been some failed projects. The magnate's attempt at creating a standard newspaper for all of Europe, the European, was seen as a misfire. His flagship, the Pergamon Press, was sold off. There were just plain idiotic moves, such as going off to Romania and filming a documentary about Nicolae Ceausescu where the tyrant was asked, with a straight face, how he accounted for his enormous popularity with the Romanian people. Not long after this, those same people would show him just how popular he was. But more than anything else, there were always the questions surrounding Maxwell's business and Maxwell himself. There were those constant rumours and purported exposés of him being Mossad's secret super spy. No matter how many legal cases Maxwell set foot on, and he set on a lot, he could never quite shake them. That old nickname of the bouncing check was hurting more than ever. He had become ever more paranoid, dropping any slight disguise of charm offensive, and actively spying on employees who he thought were disloyal to him. And more than anything, there was the undercurrent of something being very, very wrong with the Maxwell empire. But any attempts to inquire about this typically resulted in a punitive visit to the libel courts. Questions were being asked, not just by wags or journalists, but by banks themselves, worried about the empire's situation, worrying about the recession at the time that was biting quite hard, and kind of keen to start taking their cash back. And if that happened, then the empire would crumble. It was in this unsettled mood, in late 1991, that Robert Maxwell took to his yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, for a quick cruise in the Canaries. According to most people on the trip, Maxwell seemed to be relaxed and in good spirits, ready to discuss business but also ready to take a break from it all. And then, on the morning of the 5th of November 1991, his crew were unable to reach him in his private rooms. Later on in the day, Robert Maxwell's body was found in the Atlantic. It is still to many people unclear as to exactly what happened. Suicide was ruled out quite quickly, but could that have been the case? Had he had enough? Did he decide that he'd rather not be there to see what was inevitably around the corner? For the conspiracy theorist, it is pretty clear that Robert Maxwell was assassinated, perhaps poisoned in some way, maybe even by Mossad, possibly because they were worried that Maxwell's links with them were about to be proven. For the rationalist, it is pretty clear that Robert Maxwell had a massive heart attack and either died then and there, or fell overboard and drowned. Either way, he ended up in the sea. It was and remains a mystery, worthy of investigation for a lot of people. With the death of Robert Maxwell, the mountain moved, and nothing could prepare those remaining for what happened next. The death of the magnate meant that all banks lost confidence in the empire, calling in all their loans and putting Maxwell's holdings in massive debt. But the worst was yet to come. The eventual reveal was enough to make you sick. And in 1992, it became public. For years, Robert Maxwell had been propping up the empire by taking from his company's own pension funds. In particular, the fund of the Mirror Group that he had bought in 1984. To the tune of hundreds of millions of pounds. The carefully constructed image of Maxwell as this gloriously rich master of the universe, particularly in the last few years, was based on a complete lie. In fact, he was perpetually close to bankruptcy, hundreds of millions of pounds in debt, borrowing time by taking shares for himself from just about anything he saw fit. The largest estimates of the scale of this fraud place it at $1 billion. He had reportedly not seen anything untoward about this, referring often to his fund that he could use how he saw fit. The money was used to save his companies from going bankrupt time after time, again and again and again. This money was eventually partially repaid through investment banks, partially through the government. It had to be publicly funded, and even then, the people affected only received 50% of their pension funds back. It was a shocking development, an embodiment in the 90s of the darkest side of all of the business practices of the 1980s. In death, Maxwell's empire went bust. His son Kevin was declared bankrupt with over £400 million worth of debt to his name, and he himself was charged on the grounds that he must have been implicit with Maxwell's fraud. His acquittal didn't do much to change that view. The name of Robert Maxwell would be forever vilified, and rightly so. Make no mistake, if he had lived when this came out, he would have probably gone to prison for fraud, perhaps for the rest of his life. With Maxwell's death, there was nothing that could have stopped the ugly truth from coming out. But it was, of course, inevitable. This was one of those truly shocking stories, one that just kept on giving, and you'd be hard-pressed to find many falls from grace that were quite as spectacular as this one. So, what of Mirrorsoft? They were, of course, a bit part player in all of this. Jim McConaughey surely could have never conceived that this would be his company's fate, to be swallowed up in a massive tidal wave of scandal, corruption and fraud. Such an experience might well be enough to sour almost anyone on the world of video games forever. A decent if not spectacular company that hadn't ever really done all that much wrong, utterly destroyed by the machinations and thievery of their overlord. The whole Maxwell empire went into liquidation, Mirrorsoft along with it. The big names, the papers such as the Mirror, the New York Daily News, the European, would survive this and still be in circulation, and even Mirrorsoft's American sister company Spectrum Holobyte managed to survive through a merger with Microprose. But Mirrorsoft were not so lucky. The company, along with labels such as Imageworks, were bought up by Accolade in 1992, but these labels were never used by them, and the company faded away, dying long before Accolade's own demise and entry into the Infogrames empire that had claimed Ocean. It was a sudden and brutal end for a publishing company that frankly deserved nothing of the sort. So is there anything good at all to come from this story? Yes, in the end. Jim McConaughey, as I said, never really strayed too far away from video games. He'd found a love there, and a respect, loved by the fans of a genre that was always niche but filled with passion, who saw him as one of the founding fathers of the flight simulator. McConaughey kept his hand in video games, working for years with the Russian company Eagle Dynamics, where he would help create Su-27 Flanker in 1995 and Lock-on Modern Air Combat in 2003. His personal reputation as well was utterly stand-up, active on forums, a regular presence at industry events, willing to talk to anyone, always approachable, and with a heart filled with love for his genre. He intermittently took a back seat from game development at points, but he could never stay away for too long, continuing to develop flight sims right to the end. His final title, Digital Combat Simulator World from 2008, continues to host a thriving online community to this day. Jim McConaughey sadly passed away from liver cancer on the 21st of April 2013. The industry as a whole paid tribute to him, and there was a mass formation flight on DCS World servers in his honour. An appropriate tribute, and an appropriate finale. Bye for now. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, then consider subscribing. You could also follow me on Twitter, support my Patreon, or like me on Facebook. Links are in the description below. you.